The submarine moved through the narrow corridor of water with a pace that invited dismissal from every observer who relied on doctrine instead of outcomes. Its commander understood the burden of such judgment, yet he also recognized the limits imposed by machines built for endurance rather than spectacle. The hull carried a quiet tension as it pushed into an ocean that had already consumed faster vessels whose captains believed speed alone could close the distance between hope and survival. This boat relied on a different logic, one shaped by restraint, friction, and an unspoken refusal to compete with the destructive enthusiasm of more celebrated designs. Each decision inside the control room reflected this posture. Valves shifted with deliberate motion. Bearings held their rhythm without urgency. The crew adapted to a working environment defined not by rapid maneuvers, but by the expectation that the enemy would act according to patterns carved by overconfidence. This created a peculiar pressure that settled across the silent steel, a pressure born from knowing that patience would function as a weapon while opponents continued to search for targets measured by the movements of faster adversaries. The commander learned early in the patrol that the ocean rewarded those who appeared irrelevant. The slow approach encouraged enemy escorts to ignore echoes that drifted into the margins of their listening grids. These operators dismissed faint traces as background noise and continued hunting for signatures that aligned with their assumptions about hostile movement. The submarine exploited this psychological gap. Rather than darting between layers of water or attempting wide sweeps across contested approaches, it chose narrow spaces where the enemy expected nothing to happen. The quiet hull aligned itself against thermal gradients, letting the sea mask its identity. The crew operated in confined compartments where every sound, every decision, and every moment of hesitation carried weight. Their routine merged with the rhythm of machinery that favored steadiness over spectacle. The enemy's final supply artery stretched across an oceanic route that had survived repeated attacks because escorts believed their defensive pattern remained impenetrable. They relied on rapid interception and aggressive countermeasures that forced most submarines to withdraw before weapons could be deployed. The slow vessel challenged this system by refusing to behave as predicted. It approached the artery not with speed, but with endurance. It shadowed the route through layers of darkness and drifting fog that reduced visibility and encouraged human error among its opponents. The commander observed these patterns without emotion. He identified weak points created by fatigue and repetition, discovering that the enemy operated within a mechanical routine shaped by doctrine rather than adaptive thought. Inside the control room, the atmosphere grew denser as the crew recognized the significance of their position. They tracked distant vibrations through instruments calibrated for subtlety. Each reading revealed movements that hinted at the passage of heavily protected transports carrying the supplies that sustained a shrinking chain of outposts. The submarine matched its pace to this flow with a consistency that confused enemy sensors. It seemed too slow to pose a threat, too restrained to signal intent. This illusion expanded as escorts adjusted their perimeter, leaving small openings that did not exist for faster attackers. The commander allowed the boat to drift into these openings as if carried by the sea itself, compressing distance without revealing purpose. The psychological weight increased as the crew anticipated the moment when observation would transition into action. They prepared torpedo tubes with a methodical discipline shaped by long experience rather than adrenaline. They understood that once the engines of the transports aligned with the firing arcs, the submarine's slow nature would convert into an advantage. Faster vessels often overshot ideal positioning or revealed themselves through abrupt course corrections. This boat did not suffer from such vulnerabilities. It held steady, absorbing vibrations that traveled through steel as if carrying the heartbeat of the ocean. The commander evaluated bearing lines drawn not by haste, but by the cumulative logic of sustained surveillance. The crew awaited commands spoken in a calm voice that carried no trace of doubt. When a moment arrived, it did not erupt with dramatic bravado. The transition felt like an inevitable shift shaped by the mechanics of patience. The submarine released its weapons into the dark water with a quiet authority that contradicted the expectations of every adversary who believed speed and aggression defined naval warfare. The torpedoes traveled along paths calculated through enduring observation rather than reactive judgment. The enemy escorts initially interpreted the detonations as anomalies. They scrambled to identify the origin of the attack, but their assumptions prevented them from grasping that a slow and steady intruder had penetrated the perimeter they believed secure. Visibility collapsed into chaos as alarms spread across decks, forcing crews to confront a threat that did not match the model they had been trained to counter. The transports struggled to maintain formation. The destruction of one vessel destabilized the entire chain as smoke drifted into the night and confusion overtook the deck crews. The escorts attempted counterattacks, sweeping with depth charges that rumbled through the ocean without precision. Their instruments malfunctioned under the strain of chasing an enemy that refused to reveal itself. The submarine remained still, allowing currents to mask its position while the enemy exhausted its resources on empty water. This restraint amplified the effect of the attack, creating an environment where fear reshaped enemy decision-making more effectively than subsequent strikes could. As the patrol continued, the submarine exploited the fractures within the supply network. Each disruption forced the enemy to reroute shipments through narrower passages that increased vulnerability. The commander documented these shifts with clinical attention. His vessel transformed from an overlooked anomaly into a systemic threat that corroded the enemy's logistical foundation. The crew did not celebrate these outcomes. They recognized the gravity of severing lifelines that supported isolated garrisons whose endurance depended on the transports now sinking beneath the waves. Their actions demonstrated that a machine dismissed as too slow could undermine an empire sustained by maritime arteries. The psychological toll on the enemy escalated. Each report from surviving escorts described an unseen adversary that attacked from angles they could not predict. Analysts struggled to reconcile the destruction with existing doctrines, concluding that the submarine must possess capabilities beyond the known parameters of slow-moving vessels. This misinterpretation deepened the strategic confusion, encouraging defensive measures that further constrained the enemy's mobility. The submarine moved through these tightening spaces with quiet assurance, exploiting blind spots that grew wider as the enemy attempted to protect routes already compromised by the damage inflicted earlier in the patrol. The commander understood that victory in this environment did not rely on spectacle, but on the cumulative erosion of confidence. The submarine weaponized uncertainty, transforming its slow pace into a mechanism that reshaped enemy expectations. The crew maintained discipline inside compartments that echoed with a muted hum of machinery. They accepted the fatigue that accompanied prolonged silence, knowing that endurance formed the thread connecting each decision to the broader outcome. The ocean around them became a theater defined by pressure, vibration, and waiting, where every movement required justification and every delay carried potential benefit. The enemy's final surviving supply route narrowed under the weight of repeated losses. Ships once dispatched with routine confidence now embarked with apprehension, guided by escorts whose vigilance bordered on desperation. Their search patterns expanded into erratic sweeps that exposed the gaps between sectors. The submarine observed these reactions from a distance, recognizing patterns of fear embedded in the shapes of convoy formations. The commander traced these changes with an analytical mind, identifying the precise moment when logistical collapse became inevitable. The crew sensed the shift as well, understanding that the slow vessel they operated had become the axis around which the fate of an entire supply network now rotated. The ocean grew quieter as the remaining transports advanced along a route that had once carried the confidence of a nation. Their engines produced a strained cadence that revealed the weight of dwindling resources and the urgency of each voyage. Escorts circled with aggressive restlessness, pushing their machinery to extremes in an attempt to fill the widening gaps in defensive coverage. This intensity created noise that bled into their own instruments, generating false echoes and deceptive signatures that further destabilized their awareness. The submarine listened from beneath these layers, absorbing the chaotic rhythm until it could separate genuine movement from the frantic gestures of an overextended enemy. This clarity allowed the commander to map shifts in formation with a precision that eluded the surface vessels struggling to maintain order. The crew operated in an atmosphere shaped by the convergence of mechanical endurance and human focus. They monitored depth, bearing, and acoustic patterns without referencing speed as a measure of capability. Their slow vessel created an environment where motionless periods held the same strategic value as forward progress. The enemy had adapted its defensive posture to counter predators that relied on rapid strikes. leaving them vulnerable to an adversary that favored deliberate positioning. This discrepancy widened as the convoy continued along the narrow supply corridor, forcing escorts to abandon predictable patterns in favor of improvised measures that increase confusion. The submarine welcomed this instability, recognizing that each deviation from doctrine opened another opportunity to penetrate the shield that had once guarded the lifeline. The commander evaluated currents that drifted through the deep layers of water. He used them to reposition without betraying direction, allowing the boat to slide beneath the convoy at an angle that minimized acoustic exposure. The hull absorbed the pressure of descending water as it crossed through regions where thermal shifts distorted enemy sensors. These natural defenses contributed to the illusion that nothing significant existed below the surface. The escorts concentrated their attention ahead of the convoy, convinced that any attack would rely on intercepting movement rather than outlasting it. This conviction proved costly as the submarine settled into a zone where it could track the convoy's progress with unwavering clarity. The second engagement developed through a sequence of small adjustments. The commander refined the firing angle by observing the faint oscillations produced by the transport's propellers. He interpreted these vibrations as markers of fatigue and imbalance, evidence that the ships were carrying loads heavier than their reinforced frames could bear. The submarine's slow approach allowed the crew to align the firing solution without pressure from enemy countermeasures. The tension inside the control room intensified as the silence stretched between commands. The crew accepted this silence as part of the operational rhythm, knowing that precision depended on eliminating unnecessary motion. When the torpedoes left the tubes, they carried the accumulated weight of every observation recorded throughout the patrol. Their paths curved through layers of shifting temperature until they struck the supply vessels whose survival depended on assumptions that no longer held. Explosions rolled across the ocean with hollow resonance, cutting through the escort formation and reducing visibility as smoke and debris drifted across the surface. The convoy fractured once again, with transports scattering in disorganized patterns shaped by fear rather than strategy. Escorts unleashed counterattacks across wide arcs, but their weapons collided with empty water as the submarine remained hidden within currents that shielded it from retaliation. The destruction of these transports forced the enemy to confront the fragility of its final supply link. Crews on surviving escorts reported signs of psychological strain as they struggled to distinguish real threats from imagined ones. Their equipment faltered under the stress of continuous operation, producing distorted readings that eroded confidence in established detection methods. The submarine continued its deliberate movement through these zones of uncertainty, exploiting weaknesses that expanded with each failed attempt to restore defensive cohesion. The commander observed these developments without triumph, understanding that the collapse of the supply route marked a shift in the broader conflict that extended beyond the confines of his metal vessel. Strategists within the enemy command structure attempted to recalibrate their understanding of the threat. They theorized that the submarine must possess advanced technology or unconventional capabilities, overlooking the simple truth that patience and restraint had shaped every decision made during the patrol. This misinterpretation influenced defensive directives that further constrained the movement of escorts, leading to rigid patterns that exposed them to additional vulnerabilities. The submarine's crew recognized these changes as signals that the enemy had entered a phase of reactive desperation. They adjusted their procedures accordingly, maintaining the slow, disciplined approach that had defined their success from the beginning. The ocean around the convoy became a landscape dominated by fear and confusion. Escorts shifted positions with erratic urgency, leaving unguarded spaces that widened into corridors accessible to a patient adversary. The submarine entered these corridors with quiet determination, allowing the sea to carry it toward the remnants of the supply chain. The crew measured progress not in distance traveled, but in the diminishing cohesion of enemy defenses. Their slow vessel functioned as a catalyst for systemic collapse, demonstrating that the true power of a machine lay not in its ability to outrun threats, but in its capacity to reshape the battlefield through endurance. The final stages of the patrol unfolded with a grim inevitability. The convoy, reduced to isolated fragments, attempted to regroup within a sector known for unpredictable currents and limited visibility. These conditions overwhelmed escorts already struggling to maintain awareness. The submarine exploited the resulting chaos, navigating through channels carved by shifting underwater terrain. Its hull brushed against currents that masked its acoustic footprint, allowing it to remain invisible to the instruments that once dictated the enemy's confidence. The commander evaluated the disordered convoy with clinical precision, recognizing that the last pieces of the supply route now drifted within reach of a vessel dismissed as too slow to matter. The crew prepared for another engagement with the same steady discipline that had defined every action of the patrol. They understood that the destruction of the remaining transports would sever the final thread connecting distant garrisons to the resources required for survival. Their actions were guided by a detached understanding of strategic necessity rather than emotion. They accepted the burden of delivering a blow shaped by the cumulative failures of an enemy unable to adapt to an unexpected threat. The submarine moved into firing position without haste, absorbing the vibrations that traveled through steel as the crew synchronized their actions in silence. The submarine released its final strike with the same restrained force that had defined every moment of its slow advance. The torpedoes slipped into the dark water without urgency, following trajectories shaped by patience rather than speed. They traveled beneath the fractured convoy until the ocean erupted in muted flashes that marked the collapse of the last vessels holding the supply chain together. Smoke drifted across a surface disturbed by shock waves that rolled outward and dissolved into the night. Escorts circled with frantic motion, their search patterns widening into futile spirals that revealed exhaustion more than control. Their weapons detonated across empty coordinates as they attempted to impose order on a battlefield that no longer responded to doctrine or expectation. The submarine listened to these interruptions of silence without altering course, allowing the sea to obscure its retreat as enemy formations fragmented in despair. Within the control room, the atmosphere softened into a quiet tension that followed the release of pressure rather than the anticipation of it. The crew did not speak. They monitored instruments that confirmed the disintegration of the convoy, watching faint echoes drift away until the last signs of structured movement vanished. The commander observed these patterns with an expression shaped by endurance rather than triumph. He recognized that the collapse of the supply route represented the endpoint of a system that had relied too heavily on assumptions about speed, aggression, and technological dominance. His vessel had demonstrated that methodical determination could erode even the most rigid defensive structures when applied with precision and patience. This understanding settled across the crew as they resumed operations that returned the submarine to its silent passage through the deep. The enemy's response unfolded across a wider theater as surviving escorts transmitted fragmented reports that described an adversary they could not classify. Their messages carried uncertainty that migrated through command channels and shaped interpretations at higher levels. Analysts attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events, but struggled to reconcile the slow nature of the attacking vessel with the scale of the destruction it had caused. Their confusion intensified as they debated the vulnerabilities exposed by the patrol. They recognized that if a single slow-moving submarine could dismantle a critical supply route, the assumptions underpinning their broader maritime strategy required reevaluation. Yet this recognition did not lead to clarity. It produced tension between adherence to doctrine and the need to acknowledge failures that contradicted established models of warfare. The submarine continued its journey through the shadowed expanse of water, navigating currents that carried remnants of debris from the shattered supply chain. The crew worked with a steady rhythm shaped by long experience. They repaired components worn by extended silence, recalibrated instruments that had absorbed pressure from repeated dives, and prepared the vessel for the next phase of operations without expecting acknowledgement or reward. Their actions formed a pattern of maintenance that paralleled the strategic erosion taking place across the enemy's maritime network. Each adjustment, each calibrated motion, reinforced the vessel's identity as a machine designed for endurance rather than recognition. As time passed within the metal confines of the hull, the psychological weight of the patrol began to shift. The crew sensed that the destruction of the supply route had initiated consequences far beyond the sinking of individual ships. They recognized that the enemy's distant garrisons, cut off from essential resources, would soon feel the effects of the severed lifeline. These consequences would not manifest through dramatic confrontations, but through gradual decline as logistics failed to meet the demands of distant outposts. The submarine had become an invisible force that reshaped the broader conflict through absence rather than presence. demonstrating that the slow dismantling of supply networks could exert pressure equal to any direct engagement. The commander monitored the shifting patterns of ocean currents as he guided the submarine through regions marked by changing temperature and density. These environmental layers had concealed the vessel during the patrol, allowing it to move through contested waters without attracting attention. Now, they served as corridors that carried the boat away from zones where enemy forces continued searching for a threat that had already receded beyond their reach. The crew understood that their withdrawal required the same patience that had defined their advance. They maintained silence, resisted the temptation to accelerate, and allowed the slow pace of the vessel to remain its most effective form of camouflage. Enemy strategists attempted to restore order by dispatching additional escorts to reinforce the remnants of the defensive grid. These vessels navigated routes burdened by uncertainty, scanning expanses of water for signs of a submarine that had demonstrated the ability to strike from positions their instruments failed to detect. Their efforts revealed a growing realization that the threat did not conform to traditional classifications. They attempted to expand listening nets, realign patrol sectors, and implement countermeasures designed to detect rapid movement. Yet each adjustment remained anchored to assumptions that did not reflect the operational reality introduced by the slow vessel. This dissonance created structural tension within their command hierarchy, eroding confidence as reports continued to describe failures that could not be attributed to chance. The submarine traveled through these developing patterns with a detachment that reflected its purpose. It had no need to challenge the newly deployed escorts. Its impact had already been secured through the collapse of the supply route. The crew focused on conserving fuel, maintaining machinery, and preserving the operational integrity of a vessel that had endured extended periods of silence and pressure. Their discipline demonstrated that the true strength of the submarine derived from its ability to integrate human endurance with mechanical stability. This integration granted the boat a quiet authority that carried it through oceans shaped by tension and uncertainty. As the patrol neared its transition into another phase, the commander considered the broader implications of the slow vessel's success. He understood that the collapse of the supply route would reverberate across distant theaters, weakening enemy positions that relied on consistent logistical support. These consequences would unfold gradually, shaping decisions made by commanders who had once viewed their supply network as stable and resilient. The submarine had revealed the fragility of this network by functioning as a catalyst for systemic breakdown. Its slow movement, once dismissed as a flaw, had become the defining characteristic that enabled it to infiltrate defensive structures undetected. The ocean remained calm as the submarine continued its measured progress. Waves broke against the hull in muted intervals, carrying traces of distant storms that did not reach the depths where the vessel traveled. The crew operated with the same deliberate focus that had guided them through the most demanding segments of the patrol. Their actions formed a continuous thread of discipline that reinforced the vessel's identity as a machine built not for spectacle, but for sustained pressure. The commander observed the horizon through the periscope, noting shifts in cloud movement and the angles of distant currents. These observations allowed him to anticipate environmental changes long before they reached the boat, ensuring that the vessel maintained its advantage even during withdrawal. The enemy's confusion deepened as they attempted to interpret the aftermath of the transport losses. Their analysts questioned the accuracy of earlier assessments and debated whether the threat originated from a new class of submarine, an unknown technology, or an anomaly within their detection grid. These conflicting interpretations hindered the development of a coherent response. Commanders deployed vessels along routes chosen more out of fear than logic, generating patterns of movement that further weakened their defensive posture. The submarine's slow pace rendered these adjustments irrelevant, allowing it to continue operating beneath a layer of misinterpretation that shielded it more effectively than any technological innovation. The silence that settled across the ocean carried the weight of decisions made in distant command rooms where uncertainty overpowered confidence. Officers who once spoke with authority now questioned the integrity of every report that passed through their hands. Their uncertainty seeped into the operational flow of the fleet, slowing reactions and widening the psychological distance between perceived threats and real ones. This hesitation became a structural weakness that shaped the behavior of escorts deployed along approaches they no longer trusted. Their movements reflected caution rather than coordination, They lingered across sectors with erratic patterns that revealed their fear of confronting an adversary they could not classify. This erosion of conviction spread across formations until the distinction between offensive and defensive postures dissolved. The submarine, moving with its measured rhythm, passed through these disrupted patterns as if navigating through remnants of a fractured doctrine. Inside the control room, the commander evaluated subtle shifts within the water column. He read these changes not as immediate concerns, but as indicators of how the environment shaped the possibilities available to the vessel. He understood that the ocean functioned as both ally and adversary, offering concealment while demanding discipline. The crew operated within this balance, maintaining their routines with a steadiness that preserved the integrity of the hull and the machinery sustaining it. They recognized that their success derived not from isolated moments of action, but from the continuity of decisions made across the patrol. This continuity shaped their identity as operators of a machine dismissed by many, yet capable of altering the trajectory of a conflict through the precision of its methods. The enemy attempted to impose order on the chaos by gathering surviving escorts into new formations designed to project strength. These vessels traced arcs across the water that reflected a desire to reclaim control rather than a genuine understanding of the threat. Their search patterns overlapped without coherence, creating voids where the submarine could pass unnoticed. The commander evaluated these formations with a detached perspective, recognizing that the enemy's attempts to compensate for earlier failures had produced vulnerabilities more severe than those created by the original defensive posture. He guided the vessel through these openings with a patience shaped by experience, avoiding unnecessary confrontation while maintaining awareness of every movement occurring above the surface. As the submarine traveled through these contested spaces, the crew experienced a growing awareness that their patrol had entered a phase defined by reflection rather than engagement. They understood that their actions had reshaped the operational landscape by dismantling a supply route that once sustained distant garrisons. This recognition did not produce celebration, but a sober acknowledgement of the implications that followed such destruction. The crew accepted that the severing of logistical lifelines would impose conditions on the enemy that extended far beyond the sinking of individual ships. They recognized that isolated units would now face shortages that eroded their ability to function, forcing commanders to make decisions shaped by scarcity rather than strategy. The ocean around the vessel carried echoes of these unfolding consequences. The submarine passed through waters once crowded with transports and escorts that had formed the backbone of a maritime network. Now these waters lay quiet, disturbed only by the occasional drone of a patrol vessel searching for signs of an adversary that had already completed its purpose. The submarine moved beneath these patrols with the same restraint that had defined its earlier operations. Its hull absorbed the vibrations of distant engines while monitoring for changes in enemy behavior. The commander acknowledged that while the immediate battles had ended, the effects of the patrol continued to ripple outward, shaping decisions made in distant command centers that relied on supply routes, now severed by deliberate action. The slow vessel demonstrated that endurance could erode the foundations of an opposing system. This realization emerged within the enemy command structure as officers struggled to reconcile their experiences with the assumptions that had shaped their doctrine. They debated the significance of a submarine that lacked the speed typically associated with offensive capability. Their discussions produced contradictions that undermined confidence in long-held beliefs. Some argued that the vessel represented a new category of threat, while others insisted that its success resulted from errors in defensive planning. These interpretations remained unresolved, preventing the development of a unified response. The submarine continued its measured progress through the ocean while these debates unfolded, unaffected by the confusion it had generated. The crew concentrated on maintaining the vessel's readiness despite the physical and psychological demands of the extended patrol. They repaired components stressed by prolonged immersion, monitored systems that had endured silent pressure, and ensured the boat remained capable of sustaining further operations. These actions formed a continuity that reinforced the vessel's identity as a machine shaped by endurance rather than spectacle. The commander recognized that their ability to remain operational in the aftermath of the patrol served as a testament to the discipline of the crew and the design philosophy that had shaped the submarine. This philosophy prioritized stability over speed, patience over aggression, and observation over reaction. The ocean gradually shifted as currents redirected across new paths formed by seasonal changes. These transitions altered the acoustic properties of the water, creating zones where sound traveled with greater clarity or dissipated into the deep. The submarine adapted to these shifts with the same precision that had guided its earlier movements. The crew adjusted depth, course, and speed through coordinated actions that reflected their understanding of how environmental conditions shaped tactical possibilities. They recognized that the ocean functioned as a dynamic system whose behavior influenced both their concealment and their vulnerability. Their ability to interpret these conditions contributed to the vessel's continued survival. Enemy patrols increased in number as command structures attempted to re-establish control over contested regions. These patrols operated with a heightened sense of urgency, scanning for signs of an adversary whose slow pace had challenged their assumptions about speed and threat. Their movements generated acoustic disturbances that filled the water with noise, masking potential signatures while overwhelming their own detection capabilities. This noise created an environment where confusion thrived, preventing them from distinguishing between genuine threats and distortions produced by their own machinery. The submarine maintained its deliberate pace through this turbulence, using the noise as additional concealment while avoiding engagement. The consequences of the patrol extended into regions far beyond the immediate theater. The collapse of the supply route forced enemy commanders to reconsider their positions, re-evaluate the viability of distant outposts, and adapt strategies to account for the loss of resources once delivered through the severed artery. These adjustments influenced decisions made across the broader conflict, shaping movements that reflected the strain of operating without the logistical foundation previously taken for granted. The submarine's success demonstrated that a slow vessel, operating with patience and discipline, could inflict damage that extended far beyond the destruction of individual ships. It revealed the vulnerability of a system dependent on speed and predictability, showing that endurance could become a decisive force when applied with precision. The pressure generated by these shifting conditions settled across the enemy's remaining command structure like a weight that could not be redistributed. Officers tasked with stabilizing the situation attempted to impose logic on a battlefield altered by forces they had not anticipated. Their reports described a threat that moved with a rhythm foreign to established doctrine, a vessel that advanced without urgency, yet struck with precision that dismantled critical infrastructure. This discrepancy between expectation and reality eroded confidence in strategies that had guided their operations since the beginning of the conflict. Their attempts to restore coherence resulted in layers of contradictory directives that produced further confusion among units already strained by the collapse of their logistical foundation. The submarine moved beneath this unfolding uncertainty, shaped not by the turbulence above, but by the continuity of decisions made within its steel hull. The control room remained a chamber of muted concentration. The crew monitored instruments whose dials reflected the shifting interplay of pressure, temperature, and vibration. They interpreted these readings through experience that transcended the limitations of training manuals. Each indicator served as a reference point in a network of relationships connecting the submarine to its environment. The commander understood that the vessel's survival depended on maintaining this network with unwavering discipline. He issued commands in a steady tone that signaled not urgency, but continuity. The crew responded with motions shaped by muscle memory and refined through repetition, demonstrating that operational success emerged not from isolated acts of skill, but from the sustained integration of method and purpose. Above the surface, enemy formations drifted into patterns that betrayed exhaustion rather than intent. Their vessels traced lines across the ocean without cohesion, revealing a fragmentation of resolve that mirrored the unraveling of their inland positions. Supplies that once flowed with dependable rhythm no longer reached their destinations. Outposts that relied on these shipments faced shortages that strained their capacity to defend or maneuver. Commanders struggled to reconcile the demands of holding territory with the reality of diminishing resources. This imbalance produced delays that rippled across the theater, altering timelines and weakening positions that had once appeared stable. The submarine had become an unseen force shaping these developments through the consequences of its earlier engagements. The crew sensed that the ocean itself carried the imprint of their actions. Currents pushed debris from destroyed transports into distant regions where remnants floated as reminders of a collapsed supply chain. These fragments drifted across routes previously guarded by confident escorts whose vigilance had failed to prevent disruption. The submarine passed beneath these remnants, recognizing that each piece represented a decision made during the patrol and a consequence that extended far beyond the moment of impact. The commander noted how the sea absorbed these fragments without judgment, incorporating them into its vast expanse. This reflection reinforced his understanding that the vessel operated within a system shaped by forces larger than individual machines or isolated actions. Enemy patrols attempted to reassert control through displays of force that lacked strategic coherence. Their movements produced turbulence in the water that carried through the deep as tremors sensed by the submarine's instruments. These disturbances revealed the anxiety driving their actions. Escorts deployed depth charges across broad areas without identifying specific threats, hoping to create a sense of dominance rather than pursuing effective engagement. The submarine remained motionless during these phases, allowing pressure waves to pass without reacting. This stillness preserved its concealment while undermining the enemy's confidence, as each fruitless attack deepened their fear of an adversary they could not locate. The commander guided the vessel through regions shaped by the intersection of environmental complexity and strategic consequence. He interpreted subtle shifts in salinity and temperature as signals that informed his decisions. These conditions formed a complex tapestry that concealed the submarine while challenging the enemy's instruments. The crew recognized that their greatest advantage lay in understanding this dynamic environment more intimately than their opponents. Their operational rhythm aligned with the patterns of the sea, allowing them to exploit currents that masked their presence or carry them away from regions saturated with enemy activity. This synergy between vessel and environment contributed to the continued survival of the submarine during a phase when enemies roamed the waters with heightened desperation. As the submarine approached waters less burdened by enemy patrols, the atmosphere inside the boat shifted once more. The crew sensed a transition from immediate operational pressure to a broader awareness of the patrol's implications. They understood that the destruction of the supply route had initiated a chain of events that would reach distant shores, shaping decisions made by commanders who had relied on the stability of maritime logistics. The absence of supplies forced these commanders to reconsider their positions, withdraw from untenable regions, and ration resources once allocated freely. The submarine's actions influenced these decisions not through visible confrontation, but through the quiet dismantling of a system dependent on uninterrupted flow. The ocean grew calmer as the vessel advanced into deeper waters. The commander reflected on how the slow pace of the submarine, once dismissed as a flaw, had become the foundation of its success. He recognized that speed attracted attention, while restraint created opportunity. This understanding shaped his appreciation for the design philosophy that had produced the vessel. Its machinery emphasized durability over velocity, allowing it to remain operational under conditions that would strain faster submarines. The crew's discipline complemented this design, forming a cohesive unit capable of executing complex operations without reliance on momentum or force. Together, they demonstrated that effectiveness in warfare could emerge from principles that contradicted conventional expectations. The enemy struggled to rebuild its defensive structure in the aftermath of the patrol. Reports from various sectors revealed inconsistencies in resource allocation, gaps in communication, and disagreements among officers regarding the nature of the threat. Some advocated for aggressive countermeasures designed to flush out any remaining submarines, while others urged caution in light of previous failures. This division weakened their collective resolve, creating an environment where decisions were shaped by fear rather than strategic clarity. The submarine navigated through these developments with detachment, recognizing that its influence extended beyond direct engagement and into the psychological domain where doubt eroded the enemy's ability to respond effectively. The crew worked with steady concentration as the vessel progressed through waters marked by a shifting pressure and temperature. They monitored systems that had endured significant strain during the patrol, performing maintenance tasks that ensured continued functionality. These routines reinforced their bond with the vessel, transforming the submarine into an extension of their collective discipline. The commander acknowledged that their endurance had matched that of the machine, creating a synergy that empowered the vessel to accomplish objectives beyond its perceived capabilities. This synergy allowed the submarine to remain an active force even as the immediate threat diminished. The ocean's surface above the submarine reflected a shifting mosaic of clouds that drifted across the sky with a calmness that contradicted the turmoil unfolding within the enemy's command structure. Officers tasked with restoring control attempted to impose new patterns on their patrol grids, yet each adjustment revealed the lingering effects of uncertainty. Their vessels traced hesitant arcs across sectors once defended with confidence, and their instruments produced inconsistent readings shaped by mechanical fatigue and psychological strain. These inconsistencies spread through their formations like fractures in metal stressed beyond its tolerance. The submarine traveled beneath this instability with a steady composure, aware that its impact extended beyond the physical destruction of ships and into the intangible sphere where doubt weakened decisions more effectively than torpedoes. Inside the hull, the crew maintained routines shaped by the understanding that vigilance must continue even after immediate threats had diminished. They operated in tight quarters where air carried the scent of machinery and the quiet pulse of electrical systems. Their movements reflected respect for the vessel's needs, acknowledging that the submarine required constant attention to function as a unified system. The commander monitored their actions with an eye trained to detect subtle deviations from established procedures. He recognized that their discipline had formed the backbone of their success, and that the endurance of the vessel depended on the seamless coordination of human effort and mechanical reliability. This relationship created an environment where decisions flowed without disruption, allowing the submarine to navigate through the aftermath of its patrol with the same precision that had defined its earlier actions. Enemy patrols continued to sweep across wide expanses of water, yet their gestures revealed more about their anxiety than their intentions. Their sonar pulses reverberated through the deep in irregular intervals, signaling a lack of coordination that undermined their authority. The submarine listened to these signals without altering its course, interpreting them as evidence that the enemy remained trapped within a cycle of reaction rather than strategy. This reactive posture created gaps within their patrols, openings that the vessel could exploit if necessary, though the commander saw no reason to engage. He understood that their efforts lacked direction and that further confrontation would offer little strategic value. The submarine's slow pace ensured it remained outside the reach of their disorganized attempts to locate it. The broader consequences of the disrupted supply route began to manifest across distant regions, where outposts relied on the steady flow of fuel, ammunition, and provisions that once passed through the now-collapsed artery. Commanders stationed at these outposts faced shortages that forced them to ration resources with increasing severity. They altered defensive plans to account for diminished mobility and adapted to conditions that strained their ability to maintain operational readiness. Reports describing these conditions traveled back to the Central Command, adding pressure to officers already overwhelmed by conflicting responsibilities. The submarine's actions reverberated through this network, shaping decisions made by individuals who had never encountered the vessel, but who now faced the consequences of its patrol. As the submarine continued its slow progress through regions less affected by enemy patrols, the commander reflected on how the vessel had transformed its perceived limitation into an asset. The slow pace had created an operational rhythm that forced enemy escorts to misinterpret the boat's capabilities. They had expected rapid maneuvers typical of faster submarines and had oriented their defensive strategies accordingly. This expectation shaped their failure, allowing the vessel to infiltrate a protected corridor and dismantle the supply chain that supported a distant front. The commander recognized that the effectiveness of the patrol did not emerge from technological superiority, but from the alignment of design, discipline, and environmental awareness. This alignment created conditions where the submarine could alter the course of the conflict without resorting to the dramatic engagements emphasized in doctrine. The ocean remained indifferent to these developments, shifting through its natural cycles as currents converged and dispersed across vast distances. The submarine moved within these cycles, its hull absorbing subtle vibrations produced by distant storms and shifting tides. The crew adapted to these changes without altering their routines, demonstrating that endurance required flexibility in response to environmental conditions. Their ability to integrate these shifts into their operational rhythm reinforced their connection to the vessel and ensured that the submarine remained capable of sustained performance. This resilience allowed the boat to navigate through territories once defined by enemy control, but now disturbed by the consequences of their disrupted supply chain. Enemy forces attempted to reassert dominance through displays of coordinated movement, gathering vessels into formations that signaled determination rather than effectiveness. These formations moved with forced precision, their straight lines and synchronized turns revealing more about the commander's desire to project authority than their ability to address the underlying threat. The submarine observed these formations from a distance, recognizing that they represented an attempt to mask internal fractures rather than resolve them. The vessel maintained its deliberate path, using currents and thermal gradients to slip beneath regions where these formations converged. The commander understood that the enemy's efforts reflected a desire to reclaim control of the narrative by framing the disruption as an isolated event rather than a systemic failure. The collapse of the supply route continued to influence movements across the broader theater. Forces once positioned to support offensive initiatives shifted into defensive postures shaped by scarcity. Commanders debated the allocation of limited resources, choosing between reinforcing weakened positions or withdrawing to more defensible locations. These decisions reverberated through the conflict, altering timelines and shaping engagements that unfolded far from the waters traversed by the submarine. The vessel's slow progress through the ocean mirrored the gradual transformation of the broader conflict, demonstrating that strategic impact could emerge from actions that lacked the spectacle associated with decisive battles. The crew worked in silence as they prepared the vessel for continued operations. They inspected machinery for signs of fatigue, adjusted systems to account for environmental changes, and reinforced components stressed by prolonged immersion. These tasks formed a routine that sustained the vessel's operational integrity, ensuring that it remained capable of responding to future demands. The commander observed their work with a sense of continuity, recognizing that the vessel's endurance depended on the persistence of these efforts. He understood that their patrol represented not only a tactical success, but a demonstration of what could be achieved through restraint, discipline, and a willingness to challenge assumptions about warfare. The submarine advanced into deeper waters as the patterns of the conflict shifted beyond the horizon, and the commander understood that the patrol no longer belonged to the narrow frame of a single engagement. It had begun to merge with the broader current of a war defined not only by force, but by the fragility of the systems that sustained each side. The vessel's slow pace, once mocked as an operational flaw, now stood revealed as a mechanism capable of exposing that fragility with quiet precision. Its actions did not alter the conflict through spectacle or sudden upheaval. They reshaped it through the steady erosion of assumptions that had governed the enemy's confidence since the earliest days of the war. This erosion extended far beyond the sunken transports and fractured patrol lines. It reached into the structure of decision-making itself, forcing commanders to confront the limitations of doctrines that had guided their understanding of the sea. The collapse of the supply route demonstrated that victories in naval warfare could emerge from the disruption of momentum rather than its acceleration. The enemy had relied on predictable rhythms that governed the flow of resources across distant waters, believing that these rhythms were too deeply entrenched to be threatened by a single vessel. The submarine challenged this belief by inserting delay into a system that required constant motion to survive. This delay spread through the network like a fracture in metal subjected to repeated stress. It forced the enemy to confront a new reality in which slow and deliberate action could undermine their logistical core more effectively than the dramatic confrontations they had prepared to fight. The patrol revealed that the architecture of war extended beyond the visible clash of fleets and into the hidden spaces where endurance, restraint, and patience shaped outcomes that could not be reversed. The commander recognized that the significance of the patrol would emerge only with time, as commanders distant from the oceanic corridors felt the pressure of dwindling resources. These pressures would not announce themselves with explosions or sudden losses. They would manifest through silence. The silence of empty holds, the silence of units unable to move, the silence of positions abandoned not through defeat, but through exhaustion. The submarine had become an instrument of that silence, demonstrating that the collapse of a supply route carried implications larger than the visible destruction of ships. It represented the moment when a vast system began to contract under the strain of its own limitations, revealing vulnerabilities that had remained hidden beneath layers of confidence and doctrine. Historians would later observe that the success of the slow vessel emerged from the convergence of design, discipline, and circumstance. They would note that the submarine functioned not as a symbol of technological superiority, but as evidence that warfare had entered a phase with a quiet dismantling of logistics could change the course of campaigns more effectively than decisive battles. They would examine the commander's decisions and discover a pattern of thought shaped not by aggression, but by an understanding of how systems failed under pressure. They would recognize that the patrol demonstrated a principle often ignored in wartime, that endurance could become a strategic force when applied with consistency and purpose. The vessel's slow movement allowed it to observe patterns invisible to faster adversaries, and this observational advantage became the foundation of its success. The ocean that had concealed the submarine throughout the patrol now held the imprint of its passage, though not in ways visible to the surface. Its influence remained embedded within the altered trajectories of convoys, the uneasy movements of patrol vessels, and the decisions made by commanders grappling with the aftermath of a collapse they had not foreseen. The submarine's legacy lived within these adjustments, shaping the course of the conflict without drawing attention to itself. It demonstrated that power in warfare did not always manifest through rapid victories or overwhelming force. Sometimes it emerged through the gradual dissolution of structures that sustained the enemy's capacity to fight, structures so integral to their operations that their failure produced consequences far greater than the destruction of any single fleet. As the vessel continued its slow journey home, the commander reflected on how the patrol had confirmed the value of decisions made in defiance of expectation. He considered how the enemy's dismissal of the submarine's capabilities had provided the very conditions that enabled its success. This dismissal revealed a broader truth about warfare, that systems built on assumptions often fell victim to their own rigidity. The submarine, by operating outside those assumptions, had exploited the space between doctrine and reality. It had demonstrated that strategies shaped by repetition could be undermined by methods that relied on patience and restraint rather than speed and force. The crew sensed the transition into this reflective phase as they moved through routines that had become second nature. They recognized that their actions had contributed to a shift in the conflict's momentum, though they understood that their work would remain largely unseen. Their success existed not in reports adorned with accolades, but in the subtle ways the enemy's operations faltered under the weight of the collapsed supply route. They accepted that their contribution lay in shaping conditions rather than claiming victories, in altering the strategic landscape rather than dominating it. This understanding formed the quiet bond that united them as they prepared the vessel for its return. The ocean remained vast and indifferent as the submarine advanced through its depths, but the vessel carried within its steel frame the evidence that endurance could break systems more effectively than force. The patrol had shown that a slow submarine, dismissed as incapable of shaping outcomes, could redefine the boundaries of naval warfare by dismantling the logistical networks upon which entire campaigns depended. The boat's steady movement through the water symbolized the persistence of methods that challenged conventional wisdom, methods grounded in observation, patience, and the understanding that pressure applied in the right place could collapse structures far stronger than the vessel itself. As the horizon broadened before the submarine and the currents carried it toward the regions where its patrol would end, the commander acknowledged that the vessel's achievements would ripple outward through decisions yet to be made. The slow boat that had once moved unnoticed through enemy-controlled waters had become a force that altered the trajectory of the conflict through consequences that extended far beyond its physical presence. Its legacy would remain anchored in the understanding that warfare demanded flexibility of thought, an acceptance that strength could emerge from restraint, and a recognition that even the quietest actions could reshape the course of history when executed with unwavering discipline. And with this awareness, the submarine continued forward, its engines maintaining the steady rhythm that had defined its journey, leaving behind an ocean transformed by the unseen force of its deliberate path.